All right, go ahead and show Caitlin how to get the readings right here on the rock.
Okay.
I'm Bert Ashbrook, and I'm sort of the cartographer and de facto leader for this Sara Furnace project. So we started in March 2019. At that point, the Mid-Appalachian Karst Conservancy had announced that they were going to buy the cave, and the owner had given them permission to go in and start mapping. So I talked to the people at the Mid-Appalachian Karst Conservancy. That was Kim Metzger and Tom Metzger, and said I was interested in mapping the cave. The cave had never been mapped. The Mid-Appalachian Region business meeting had been at the end of February. I tried to organize a trip there. Hope Brooks, Phil Gawadi, and I arranged to go out to the cave on March 5th, 2019. And we went in the cave, and so we started from the entrance and started our survey that very day. This is my first trip report. It was 11 degrees out with perhaps 4 inches of snow. Someone had rigged a hand line at one particularly slippery spot approaching the entrance, but that didn't stop me from taking a tumble. We entered about 10:15 a.m. and did a quick tour of some of the mined out sections in the front of the cave. We then returned to the entrance, checked Hope's Disto versus my Suntas, and began the AAA survey, marking stations with red nail polish. We set 20 stations for 277 feet in the mine sections near the entrance by about 2:30 p.m. This was my first survey trip in maybe 15 years. I am certainly not as young, thin, and flexible as I was then.
Jeff John visited the cave on April 16th, he wrote. Once the survey became apparent the passages all interconnected in a tight joint pattern of loops. Some are just big enough to fit through, but others require some effort to navigate, especially when maneuvering around 90-degree bends in the passages. It was a fun-filled afternoon, and time went by quickly and as funny as can be, because after 3.5 hours, we were still in sight of the entrance. Turned out we surveyed about 180 feet of passage, all in the footprint of about 30 feet by 30 feet.
From April 17th, we have taken the attitude that while the cave isn't virgin, it's new to us, and therefore we're going to survey as we go. We also figure that we don't want to leave any cave to mop up, because if we survey all the big stuff first, then the ugly stuff will never get done. With that in mind, we picked up the survey where we'd left off the day before, namely a mazy crawlway just inside the entrance. We have tried to stick to that same philosophy as survey as you go through the last almost 3 years of surveying Sara Furnace Cave. We've tried to take our survey and just expand out from the entrance rather than trying to survey the big passages first and leaving all the side passages for mop up. We've had, I think, 86 survey trips to Sara Furnace Cave over the past close to 3 years. Typically now, we schedule 2 or 3 survey trips every month. We'll schedule 3 in the summer, including one Saturday, Sunday back to back, and then another weekday in the summer. And then spring, winter, fall, we schedule 1 weekday trip and 1 Saturday trip each month. Today, on January 10th, 2022, we're at 6.43 miles. about 36,000 feet, a little over 10 kilometers.
The cave is developed in the 6 to 10 foot thick Vanport limestone and consists primarily of a dense grid of crawlways with intersecting cross passages every 6 to 8 feet. There are literally miles of passage under a relatively small surface area. The passages range in size from so low and tight they are barely passable to a more typical size of 2.5 feet high and wide. The largest natural passages found in the cave so far are 4.5 feet tall and are limited to one small area. The floor of the passages is covered by a red-brown clay that may be several feet thick. Intersecting these natural cave passages are some mine-enlarged passages. In the 1860s, the natural cave passages were used to access a 2-foot-thick iron ore layer, the Burstone ore, which overlies the Vanport limestone. Passages were enlarged, and the ore is mined from the ceiling for use in a local iron furnace. The ceiling in some of the mined areas is unstable.
I've always been curious about the Vanport caves because they're so different than anything else in Pennsylvania. I'm a geomorphologist, I guess, at heart, and so I read a lot of literature and try to keep up on stuff. And there was an article, I think it's Pennsylvania Geology, the State Geological Society's magazine, and it was on Lake Monongahela. And right at that time, I was sitting there putting down some of the things that I was seeing in the cave and the lack of Vados features. So I was sort of wondering what was going on, and I read that. And then I looked at the other elevations of the caves, and they're all pretty similar. And from about 1060 to 1120, that seems to be the range. The Vanport is exposed from about 1,400 foot elevation down to about 700 in northwestern Pennsylvania, the cutting of the rivers and things. There aren't any major Vanport limestone caves at any other elevations in this narrow band where you get the major cave development. So that was the other thing that just, really stood out once I started looking at it.
Sara Furnace Cave is a floodwater maze cave. Floodwater from a lake or river backs up under pressure into the joints within limestone bedrock, and if the water is chemically undersaturated with calcite, the limestone begins to dissolve along the joint surfaces, forming a network of passage all similar in size. It was initially believed that the caves formed by flooding from the Allegheny River as it downcut through the Vanport limestone. All of the 9 major Vanport caves, including Sara Furnace, Harlansburg, Brady's Bend, and Hyman's Cave, are all 2-dimensional maze caves. All the known Vanport caves are developed within 150 feet of each other at an elevation between 1060 and 1210 above sea level. The caves are all developed in nearly flat-lying bedrock, and the caves are all located within 30 miles of the glacial ice advance fronts. He proposes the cave is formed by flooding from glacial Lake Monongahela during the lake's high stand, which took place from about 900,000 to 788,000 years ago.
I've been a member of MAKC for a long time. I knew they were buying Sara Furnace Cave, and I think I went up with Tom. Let's see, I think the first time we went up just to sort of lay out approximately where the property line would be for their purchase of the cave. Then I think we went up another time to actually set the line, maybe. Anyway, Tom said, well, you might be interested. Bert Ashbrook is going to be mapping the cave and started mapping. You might be interested, So get a hold of him if you're interested. So I did. I've been pretty involved since then.
I first went into Sara Furnace Cave in 1992. I have a cave diary that I've kept, and my fiance, now my wife of 27 plus years, was with me on that trip. I've just been impressed with these Vanport mazes ever since, and especially Sara Furnace. What's really unique about Sara Furnace is how dense the cave passages are. When we survey between stations in the cave, we set a survey station at every intersection. And our average shot length is about 7 feet. So there is an intersection at about every 7 feet within the cave. From the amount of passage surveyed and that amount of area that the cave underlays, you can calculate a figure which is called passage network density. Passage network density is a statistic developed by a Ukrainian caver named Alexander Klimchuk to measure a degree of maziness of some of the famous gypsum caves over there. And the units are length of survey divided by area underlain. The maziest caves in the world up until now have been around 300 or so kilometers of passage per square kilometer of area. And the figures that we're coming up with for Sara Furnace are around 600 kilometers per square kilometer. And that is the basis for our thought that Sara Furnace Cave may be the maziest cave in the world. We have yet to find a cave that has a higher passage network density than Sara Furnace Cave. This kind of cave survey appeals to me because there are not many ways that non-scientists can really contribute to our knowledge of the world. You hear about amateur astronomers discovering comets, amateur bird watchers contributing to the knowledge of what birds are around and their quantities. But cave mappers really get to contribute to our knowledge of the world by exploring and finding out how far the cave goes and where it goes and what the conditions are in the cave. And all these other scientific studies of the environment and the ecosystem in the cave, the macrofauna, the microfauna, the geology, the hydrology, the archaeology, all of those other disciplines depend on having a map. And it's a way that amateurs, without a lot of expensive equipment, can go on a weekend and add to mankind's scientific knowledge of the world. The way the cave survey works is we set a series of stations on the walls of the cave at each intersection, all within line of sight of the next station and from the previous station. From each station to each station, we take 3 measurements. We measure the distance, we measure the horizontal compass angle called the azimuth, and we measure the vertical angle.
Plus 3.4.
What angle it is
Correct.
up or down from level, called the inclination. Then we take those and do the trigonometry and figure out the XYZ coordinates of each of those survey stations, and then draw the cave in around those stations. Those stations serve as sort of a skeleton for the sketch of what the cave looks like. Having finished that, you come back out of the cave. Then we take those data, plug it into a computer, and the computer will close any loops. That is, if a loop doesn't close well, it will average out the error to close the loops and give us a sort of a skeleton of the cave. And then we transcribe those in-cave sketches onto computer drawing of the cave around that skeleton. And that's what forms the map. When we're teaching people how to survey, the easiest job is how to read the Disto X2 survey instrument. Because once you learn which button to push, all you have to do is push a button and let the laser bounce off the target and then read the numbers. That's the easiest job. The second job involved with surveying we call the point person. And that person has to pick where the survey stations will be and also read a survey instrument going back the opposite direction, what we call a backsite. And that's a little bit more difficult because picking those survey points has to be done with a lot of care. This cave has so many intersections in it that from each survey station, you have to have a good line of sight down every side passage. And that takes quite a bit of skill to place those survey stations somewhere where you have good line of sight and where somebody crawling past won't destroy it by brushing against it and erasing any trace of it from the wall. The third position typically we have in a survey team is called the sketcher or a bookkeeper. That person has two functions. First, they record all the data, which stations are shooting to which stations, what the distance and the azimuth and the inclination are. And they also make a sketch of what the survey passage looks like around those stations, where the walls are, where the rocks are, where the stalactites and stalagmites are relative to those stations. And that takes a little bit of artistic skill and recognition of where you are, what orientation you're facing. If you're good at reading maps or orienteering, you're often good at doing that sketching and bookkeeping job. We can train someone to be a good instrument reader in a day, and we can train someone to be a good point person in a day or two. But our project to survey Sara Furnace Cave has always had a shortage of good sketchers and good bookkeepers. And to solve that problem, we organized in the fall of 2020 a seminar to teach people who were already part of our survey team who wanted to learn to keep book and learn to sketch. And we brought in some really world-class teachers, good sketchers who know what they're doing. And we had 9 students and 4 teachers. And we taught people to sketch, to solve the problem that we didn't have enough good sketchers and bookkeepers. So we had a full day seminar, including classroom sessions on the surface and in-cave working sessions underground.
Yes, so I am a member of the Greater Allentown Grotto, which is sort of the grotto that takes care of the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, and north and south of the Lehigh Valley. And one of the members of that grotto is Bert Ashbrook. When Bert indicated that he was going to start a surveying project, he roped in quite a few folks from the Greater Allentown Grotto, and one of the people was myself. He started in March of 2019. I did not join until the end of June 2019 with my daughter, Caitlin. Caitlin and I went on the very last trip of June. We went with the sense of wanting to find out a little bit more about the surveying process. I was pretty new to the surveying process, and Caitlin had never been involved in it. So the two of us were linked up with Bert in the first cave trip, and he taught us the surveying process.
I guess a little over a year ago, back in July of 2019, Dad had heard about this cave, which is closer to my house than his, and that they needed people to come out and learn to survey. And I said, sure. The cave itself, I don't know what I was expecting, but not the honeycomb of passages that we came upon. But Dad and I got to work with Bert for our first trip. I think Dad was on point and I was on instrument, and then Bert was doing the sketching. And it was clear to both him, to Bert and to me from the first time I went, that I'd do well sketching. And so the second time I went, I became a sketcher. I've always been interested in art to some degree, but having the boundaries that you have when you're sketching, working on some graph paper, having the compass to sketch out the angles properly makes it a lot easier to fill in the gaps. And so the combination of the analytical side of things with then the creative side of trying to sketch in the walls exactly or as close as possible, and then deciding what other details to fill in, really clicked with me. I've noticed that in Sara Furnace Cave, we could spend 5 or 6 hours surveying 200, 250 feet of passage, but in that time, you get to see the beautiful crystalline structures, you get to see the fossils in the limestone layer, and a lot of little things that you wouldn't have noticed if you were simply sport caving and pushing leads and going through for speed and enjoyment. I enjoy that at the end of the trip, I get to come out and see what I've made and see how I've contributed to the sum total of human knowledge, basically. I like looking at the map that we have now and picking out the little places that I got to sketch of it. It's cliche, but I would say that it's the people that I enjoy about this cave survey. Bert is the most wonderful, fearless leader. He's taken everybody under his wing and taken those of us who are complete novices to cave survey and elevated us up to be able to contribute. And having the little celebrations when we pass another landmark, move our cave up on the list of total surveyed length, and just the little jokes we share and the fellowship spent over meals.
One of the things that we've used to try to entice people to come, and especially to survey in some of the smaller passages, is what we call a tiny tight team. And we've tried to make being a member of a tiny tight team into a badge of honor, because it involves going into this cave and lying in the mud where you can't get off your belly for hours at a time. And so we have a number of people who again and again have agreed to be on our tiny tight teams because they like it, and God bless them. Some of the tiny tight team members are Trevor Ciccinelli, Frank Vlicek, Hope Brooks. There's just been a number of people who've agreed to go in multiple times in these tiny passages. They are just so valuable to our Team Sara project.
It all goes back to Bert. Bert takes a look at me. I'm very thin build, and he said, "Would you like to be on a tiny tight team?" And I looked at all the other tiny tight members, and none of them are tall. I'm 6'2". You know, I used to be 6'3". I've shrunk over the years. And I said, "Bert, I'm 6'2". I'm not exactly tiny tight." He says, "Plus you're thin. You'll work fine." And then when I've talked to other people that have been up in that northern Porcupine Slut Maze area that are a little taller, they all said, "Well, you know, it's going to be rough." And you're kind of limited, not by how thin you are, but you're limited by your length, or I am anyway, by my length. And more often than not, it's the length of your femur, you know, the longest part of your body. The real difficulty is just the size. When you're in one of those passages, you're all basically filling the passage. So anytime you want to turn around or make a bend, you have to really figure out how you're going to do it. If you want to turn around, you definitely have to get to an intersection, and it has to be an intersection where your body actually can bend and turn into, so you can turn your body around. And of course, the reason you have to turn around is every time you set a station, you have to be facing the opposite direction in order to shoot back between the two stations. You can't set a stations and shoot past your body because your body is filling up the whole passage. So you have to turn around and get behind that station in order to shoot and get out of the way. That's the main difficulty, is just moving around, and everything goes real slow because you have to move around and you have to back up and go forward or back way up to the last intersection so you can turn around and then back up the passage you were just in to get back to your station so you can make your shot. And then there's also, when you're making the shot, it's not always easy to hold that disto the correct way on your station and aim it to the station where your partner is and get a good clean shot with possibly 2, 3, or even 4 times doing it. You know, your partner looking where the laser's pointed and getting you on target and shooting back and forth like that. You're always contorted in weird positions trying to get shots just because everything is so small and so tight. Great, Virgin Cave. And that's one of Bert's monikers, of trying to draw people into surveying up there, being part of a tiny tight team. He says, he'll guarantee you're going to have Virgin Cave. Yes, but it's not real easy going big borehole Virgin Cave. It's squirming and pushing and, you know, pushing your body to the limit kind of Virgin Cave. And it just seems to go and leading you on a little at a time. And oh, I can see it opens up past here, but I can't get through there. And a lot of times on the map, you'll mark dig because we can't get through. But if we dug it, we might get through and get to that part that looks big enough for you to get through into a bigger section. But at the same time, a lot of times you'll survey up around and you'll find that section that you couldn't get to because you've looped around. All tight passage, of course, but it's exciting. It is fun, and we have a real good time doing it. I have a real good time with my normal partner, which is Trevor Chickenelli, and it's just a good time. I mean, sure, we'd like to get 100-foot shots all over the place, but what we get to do is we get to claim Sara Furnace as the most passage dense cave in the world. When you have cross passages every 5 to 8 feet, that's a lot of passage. We typically are in there somewhere between 5 and 6 hours, and we'll get someplace probably between 6 and 10 stations. It takes a long time to do this in that real tight area. And we'll get 60 to maybe 100 feet. Our biggest day, I think, was 130 feet, and that was really exceptional. Trevor always says anything over 100 is exceptional, but 80 is good. I mean, we've had days up there where we got maybe 40 feet just because of what it is. It's very slow going, and you get what you get. Oftentimes when I'm in there, I have to take my helmet off because I just can't move around with my helmet on. It's in the way. So I push my helmet in front of me and light my way to see what's going on. And your head is always cocked to one side and you can't turn your head and look around in the other direction. So you're always stuck in that position for a long, long time. The last time Trevor and I were in there surveying, we had to fill in some gaps that were left in other surveys. And that's one thing that happens. Like I was just talking about, your head's always turned in one direction when you're going through a passage and you can't turn and look the other way. A lot of times when you're doing that, you don't realize you're going by a passage behind your head. And you just go by it looking for the next intersection and you can't see that one because your head's turned in the wrong direction. We were up there and we were excited because we found what we called the tiny tight borehole, which was a passage that was probably maybe 18 inches high, and but it was straight and it looked like it just went for 20 feet or more. And when we went back in to survey it, I went through it and I went to the end where before I found out it didn't go much farther than the 20 feet, and then it just pinched out and I couldn't get through anymore. So Trevor decided to see if he could go up to get through the end. I said, you might be able to because he's shorter than me, basically. He got halfway up there. He said, did you see this passage to the side? And I go, no, I missed that because my head was turned the wrong direction. And it was a passage and actually water in it, which, was different for that section of the cave.
Over the 47 trips through the end of 2021, I've taken probably 1,500 pictures during that 3-year period. And it's kind of split between the people that are on the survey teams, the formations and the natural geology of the cave, and sort of the mammals and the invertebrates that you find in the cave. And I like to tell stories. And the way I tell stories is when I go on something like a survey trip, or I go on a hike, or I go into a cave, I take pictures and I sort of curate those pictures to tell a story. And then I put them on Facebook as an album so that other people can enjoy this wonderful resource that is Sara Furnace Cave. But I like to tell the story, and I like people to see what caving is like, especially non-cavers.
Hi, I'm Kim Metzger. I've been a founding member and I'm the current chairman of the Mid-Atlantic Karst Conservancy. We're based in Pennsylvania. We were formed in 1997 after undergoing an extensive protest to save some caves in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. So in November of 1997, we got 10 other cavers involved and we pitched in $10 each and had a meeting and decided to incorporate. There are 4 really long caves in Pennsylvania that are formed in what's called the Vanport limestone. There's a cave near the town of Sara Furnace on the Barbara Schomer Preserve, which we bought 3 years ago. And this cave was also one of those caves, and we knew that it had the potential to be longer than even Harlansburg. But it had always been on our list. Sometime around 2008 or 2009, we discovered that the property had been sold. So our first step was to arrange with the owner some trips to the cave, and these trips occurred in 2008 and 2009. He was open to selling the property, but he was trying to sell it all in one big clump. And sometime 2016 or 2017, we broached the possibility again. He was amenable at that point to subdividing. We finally negotiated a deal, and it was figured we would buy a 20-acre parcel because we knew the potential extent of this cave, and we wanted to make sure that we bought as much of the land overlying the cave as we thought possible. So we agreed on 20 acres and $100,000. Now, coming from a group that 10 people pitch in $10 to form, and we're crawling around digging pennies, nickels, and quarters out of the wishing well at Laurel Caverns to incorporate, we were a little nervous, but I had figured out a fundraising plan, talked to some people ahead of time, and it was a long process. It took all my free time for 6 to 8 months with the initial fundraising and planning, but we were able to do it and actually raise the money, pay cash for it in 6 months. So we did that and then decided to name the cave after Barbara Schomer, who was a longtime Pittsburgh Grotto member who was active in many, many areas. We had a bequest and thought that it would be very appropriate to honor her with this significant Western Pennsylvania cave purchase.
In 1859, Samuel Plummer purchased property along the Allegheny River below the cave from James Benninger to build an iron furnace. There were dozens of small iron furnaces in western Pennsylvania in the 19th century, including 33 in Clarion County alone. Iron furnaces were squat towers that had a hollow interior. Inside the furnaces, charcoal or coke was used to heat a mixture of iron ore and limestone to produce raw iron pigs that were in turn sent by flatboat down the river to Pittsburgh for sale. Sara Furnace began operation in late 1859 or 1860 and processed raw materials from the Benninger property. The furnace later passed into the hands of Jennings and Morey and Company and was abandoned around 1867. Miners used the natural cave passages in Sara Furnace Cave to facilitate mining of the burstone ore as an iron ore source and the limestone as flux in the smelting process. Signs of the mining efforts are prominent in the cave. There are mined and large passages themselves. The mine passages are generally higher than the natural cave passage and extend upward to the base of the overlying containing sandstone. There are areas where the ceiling in mine areas were propped up by wooden mine posts. Some of these 160-year-old posts are still supporting the ceiling, others not so much. There are extensive stone walls or cribbing present in many of the passages that serve to help support the mine ceiling and also to get rid of waste rock from the mining operation. There are stacked stone pillars present that also serve to help support the mine ceilings. People might think the mining operation has increased the length of passage in the cave, but the opposite is true.
You were asking about whether the mine part counts as the length of the cave, and it does. Here's one of the reasons why. What you can see here are 3 different passages that make a triangle where your feet are. That used to be the ceiling, and there were 3 passages that went around this triangle. That we would have had to survey around. But because of the mine, they've made it into one single room, having removed all the iron ore. So it's actually shortened the length of the cave by the mining. The other thing that shortens the length of the cave is because the miners piled up gob rock, the waste rock, in some of the side passages, so that you can no longer go through them. And because of that, that also shortens the length of the cave.
Where the burst stone ore is exposed in the walls of the mine passages, sections of drill holes can commonly be seen in the exposed ore. These were made by hand drills. A miner would hit the end of a chisel-shaped drill with a hammer, rotate it a little, then hit it again, eventually forming a drill hole. Sometimes teams of 2 or 3 miners would work together with one person holding the drill bit and the others swinging the hammers. At the time, black powder was commonly used in mining. A miner would partially fill the drill hole with black powder and a fuse, pack the hole shut with clay, then they would light the fuse and back away. The black powder explosion would shatter the surrounding ore. There are at least 2 prominent mine passages that lead to collapse areas that were once mine portals. One is called the hallway, the other is called the railway. In the railway passage, there are sleeper logs. These logs are about 3 feet apart and buried in the mud. Overall, they are in poor shape, but do provide evidence of a former rail system that used carts to help carry the mined rock from the cave. It's not clear if the mine used wooden rails or iron rails, but in either case, they were apparently removed once the mining ended. Other items found in the cave/mine that date from the mining era include several handmade nails and some bottles. One bottle with an oil and a wick was found on a ledge in the sewer section of the cave. It was likely used to help light the cave as the miners worked.
That process, we were going to where we were starting, and my daughter Caitlin, she noticed a chisel, and we picked it up. We took pictures of it in place, picked it up, took pictures of it with some sort of contextual object next to it. I think it was my disto container. And then we brought it out to Tom Metzger, who happened to be there because this was during the celebration of hitting 5 miles for Sara Furnace Cave. And he looked at it, took it back, did some research into it, found it didn't have any markings in the context of manufacturer. But given where it was, which is a mine passage, I'm pretty sure it had something to do with the mining, and it was probably from the 1860s, but that's just a guess on my part.
There are a number of historical signatures in the cave. Some have dates while others do not. Several signatures of William Soper were found, and one was dated 1868. Chris Hill's research shows that William Marshall Soper was born in 1851 in Harrisville, Butler County. His father, John Soper, ran a foundry and operated a coal mine in Butler and Venango counties before moving to Clarion County, where he took up farming in 1868. William Soper himself eventually became a farmer in Toby Township, Clarion County, where he died in 1924. Nearby is also a block letter signature A. Shepherd, with the dates 1868 and 1879. There is a rock bearing the initials HAD and a date 1893 from what we call the 1893 room. There are a number of other signatures present in the cave as well. The Butler Citizen published an account of a visit to the cave from 1894. It reads, "A monster cave. At about noon Tuesday, an even dozen of men left this place to explore a limestone cave of large dimensions that has been known to exist at Sara Furnace, but no end was ever found. The party was dressed in all kinds of various costumes, and we never yet remember of seeing any persons who looked more like genuine tramps than they. Some places it was necessary to get down on hands and knees, and here is where a portly person is at a disadvantage, as Reverend C.C. Rumbarger, who was one of the party, fully realized. Considerable sport was had at the expense of Reverend Rumbarger, however, when attempting to make a shortcut back to the main party by a narrow passage, he became stuck fast, and in this position he claimed assistance. Some took hold of him in the front, while others pushed from behind, and by energetic pushing and pulling, combined with hearty oh-heaves, he was finally gotten out of the difficulty and enjoyed the laugh at his expense. The party returned in the evening after having been underground about 5 hours. It is an enormous cavern, and if anyone is seeking adventure, here is a chance to have it satisfied."
So part of the survey of the cave is not just a survey of the actual extent of the passages, but it's also a survey to determine what kind of resources and other life forms are living in the cave. So, for example, we've been looking at the geology of the cave. Chris Hill, who is a professional geologist, and Katie Schmid, who is a geologist with the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, have both been looking at the geology of the cave. We're also looking at the biology of the cave, the insects and bats and porcupines and amphibians that may be in there. We've recruited the biology department at Clarion State University to look at those sort of macrofauna. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic sort of put in an indefinite pause on that effort really before it got started. There are a number of academics that are helping us with this project. Let me just mention a few of them. Will White, who is really the leading figure for Pennsylvania caving, retired now from Penn State, and who explored the cave back in the 1950s and wrote about it, has really been enormously helpful in guiding us and encouraging the project. One of his former students from Penn State is now at the University of Akron in Ohio. That's Iris Sasowski. He's been interested in doing a sediment study in the cave.
Chunks of it. So let's add to that. That whole.
That's okay.
But the academic who's really been the most hands-on help to us so far is Dr. Hazel Barton from the University of Akron in Ohio. Now, Dr. Barton is probably the first academic who's really made her career on microbiology of caves and how it affects not just the life in the cave, but actually is critical in speleogenesis and in the secondary growth in the cave. And she's just really pioneered that field of study. And she's done some of those studies inside the cave, some collecting in the cave to see the kind of microbiota that live in this Vanport limestone cave.
Yeah, she was looking for bugs in Sara Furnace Cave that would be helpful to her in her work at the time. She had petri dishes for everybody, and we were all going around with swabs and not for COVID, but for cave bugs.
Dr. Barton's real biggest contribution so far as I'm concerned, has been in actually surveying the cave itself. Because in addition to being an academic and studying the microbiology of caves, Hazel Barton is really an expert cave surveyor and has won awards for the cave maps that she's created.
Now we're entering the lake room on the Yellow Trail. In here is a thermometer that we use to keep track of the temperature inside the cave. It usually doesn't vary more than about a degree. And a couple of gauges to measure the water level. So, Ed, you read the thermometer there. What's the thermometer read?
47 degrees Fahrenheit.
All right. That thermometer reads 28 degrees when it's put in ice water. So we add 4 degrees to the thermometer reading.
51.
So it's 51 degrees in here. And the thermometer is hanging from one of our water level gauges. What's that gauge read for the water level?
About 2.5 inches.
All right, 2.5. There is a second gauge over there.
And that's just about the same.
So also 2.5 inches. Okay, good. So we have seen, this is about as high as the water gets that we've seen in the 10 months that we've had these gauges installed. We've seen the water as low as -9 inches. Now 0 inches is the floor elevation on this gauge here. This gauge is actually in a deep hole that was excavated. And that's how we can measure a negative water level.
By far the most common type of creatures in the cave are invertebrates. We have found daddy long legs, cave crickets, centipedes, isopods, and a variety of other insects. We're just starting to document the types of invertebrates found in the cave, and I'm sure the list will continue to grow as we do our research.
One of the most interesting things that I found was the porcupine. I love animals, and my daughter was with me. It was our second trip into the cave, and we had just gotten to the dome, which is not that far from the entrance. And to the left, as we were scrambling over the breakdown, the porcupine was in there.
We were going down to the hallway, the main passage of the cave, and I was looking around because in the previous trip I had seen piles of porcupine scat that looked pretty fresh, and I just happened to notice a little porcupine sitting down there. So we got pictures on the way in, and I think we got a few pictures of it on the way out too.
I'm not kidding. I think 50, 55 photos were taken of the poor thing. It was there the whole time we were in the cave, so on the way out, he had to pose again. And we got some great pictures, and my daughter Caitlin, one of the pictures she took, she entered into the Great Allentown Fair, as it's called, in Lehigh Valley in 2019, and she got a blue ribbon. It was a very nice picture of a porcupine, turned it into a black and white just to get the contrast better. And it was.
Porcupine encounters have taken place in the cave for a long time. Edward Frank reports that in the 1980s, he encountered a porcupine in the porcupine room. In 1996, Michael Patton reported, "We found the entrance to Sara Furnace Cave at night. It was an exciting moment knowing we had another Vanport cave to explore. When we entered the cave, we were not more than 20 feet inside the first passage when we encountered a family of porcupines charging towards us. We turned around and quickly exited the cave. We made it outside the cave entrance, and the porcupine family ran past us and disappeared into the woods. We must have waited 15 minutes or so before we decided to enter the cave again. On April 4th, 2021, yet another porcupine encounter took place. I'd given out GoPros to mount on several people's helmets, and one of them captured a porcupine entering a small passage on the far side of the back room in the cave.
There is just porcupine scat everywhere up there. You're just in it totally. It's everywhere. You can't go anywhere without laying in it.
So the entrance of the cave has cameras that have been put there by MAKC just to gain information about not just the wildlife, but human visitors to the cave. And the people in MAKC have gathered pictures of maybe 14 different mammals that have been there. And whether it's bears or coyotes, there's foxes, there's raccoons, there's porcupines, and there's fishers. Now, fishers were reintroduced in Pennsylvania by the Game Commission a couple decades ago in a couple of counties in the northern part of the state. And their range has grown as the porcupine population has reestablished itself. In the entrance to the cave, we found porcupine quills and blood. And the obvious conclusion was, since porcupines only have cars, humans, and fishers to worry about in this part of the state, that the poor thing was eaten by a fisher, killed and eaten by a fisher. So it was an unfortunate part of the natural selection process that the fishers come into the cave to hunt. And the poor porcupines who use the cave instead of hanging around in eastern white pines, which is where they usually hang around, this one got eaten.
Probably the most surprising thing that we found was the Allegheny dusky salamander. I didn't actually spot it. Christian Galen, who was surveying with me, was the one that noticed it and wanted to know what it was. And it was a very young example of Diacrophius, the Allegheny salamander. And the thing was about the length of a man's thumbnail and not much larger. And it had to be very young because it still hadn't lost its gills, and they typically lose their gills in the first 24 to 48 hours. So that was pretty cool.
We've seen a lot, not a lot. We've seen a number of bats hibernating in the cave in the winter, and we try to leave those alone. The cave used to be a more significant bat hibernaculum before white nose syndrome struck these cave hibernating bats. Now we tend to see maybe half a dozen each winter on different trips, not more than 2 on any particular trip. So it's really cut the bat population down significantly.
There are numerous speleothems in the cave. Most are small in size. A speleothem is a secondary mineral growth. That means they grew in the cave cavity after the cave formed and not a primary feature of the bedrock itself. There are all normal calcite, calcium carbonate speleothems, flowstone, stalactites, and soda straws. There are a lesser number of stalagmites also present. There are a large number of helictites. These are typically made up of calcite, aragonite, or a mixture of the two. Both calcite and aragonite have the same chemical formula, but the molecules are arranged in different patterns in each of the forms. In the bottom of some of their pools, there appears to be a slurry of calcite, but it has not been sampled for analysis. There are numerous anthodites and frostwork growing on the ceiling of the cave. These speleothems form radiating pincushion-like clusters of crystals and are generally made of aragonite. Anthodites are thicker crystal structures with a hollow interior tube, while frostwork clusters are needle-like. In some of the crawlways, there are selenite, or calcium sulfate needles growing out of the forest sediment. Thin crusts of ore-like gypsum are also found in these areas. Elsewhere in the cave, there are a number of unusual metal oxide speleothems related to the iron in the overlying siderite and burststone ore, and to the iron pyrite and other minerals in the Katanning sandstone above the burststone ore. We have found flowstone, stalactites, and soda straws made of goethite, an iron hydroxide mineral, limonite flowstones, and stalagmites. Limonite is a non-crystalline mixture of various iron oxides and hydroxides and clays. We also have found some iron trihydroxide, the orange mineral that forms from acid mine drainage, and perhaps some hematite iron oxide crusts on flowstone, and some black manganese oxide crusts. Additional mineral varieties may be found as we start to look at the cave mineralogy in more detail.
Okay, so this is restoration. There's a lot of that fishing line through here, and we have been pulling it, cutting it up, and it's kind of handy to stuff it in an empty Gatorade bottle to get it out of here.
If we can.
If we can. So,
I think we can.
Yeah. You just got to keep stuffing.
Oh, yeah.
I figured we'd have, a couple or three people on each trip, and they knew how to survey, and, we'd get, 500 or 1,000 feet every trip, and none of that has turned out to be true. We've been able to maintain a lot of interest, a lot of new surveyors, younger cavers who had never surveyed before. So we've had to teach surveying and cave surveying and sketching to those people. And all of that makes it a lot more administration work than I'd anticipated. That's, for me, the caving is not particularly difficult. The surveying is not difficult. The mapping is not difficult. The real difficult part of this project is organizing people. That's the challenge for me.
I feel very lucky to be able to contribute sort of in a citizen science way to finding out all about the interesting and fascinating parts of this cave. It's, like I mentioned before, it's smelly, it's wet, it's tight, it's typical Pennsylvania borehole in a lot of ways, but it's the maziest cave in the world. It's got formations and geology that are unique. It's got mammals that are unique. And where else could I have a project that I'm contributing to this, finding out what's in this cave and mapping it and documenting the history of it. It's just been fascinating. I feel very lucky to be able to do this. And
this is one of the attractions to caving for me. And that is, there's no way of telling how far a cave might go, where the passages are. There's no ground radar. There's no electronic device you can use. There's no way to tell except by having a caver go in and push to get through the small passages and look under every nook and cranny and rock to find a way. That's the only way to find it. And we found a lot of virgin cave here in Sara Furnace, which has been known for 160 years, and no one's been in these passages, and nobody knows how far they might go into the mountain. The most exciting thing that we're looking forward to in surveying is the whole sort of southeastern part of the cave. We kept up, we were like running into a wall. Every passage that headed to the southeast was getting too low, filled with mud. You couldn't find your way through. And we kept on going further, and we'd run into the same obstacle, further and run into the same obstacle, another trip and run into the same obstacle. And finally, this past fall, the fall of 2021, we made a breakthrough. We found a passage that got around this wall. And all of a sudden, there was a passage to the southeast that wasn't too small. We could get through it. And on the other side of that, it opened up, and there's big cave, big for Sara Furnace, big cave going all over. And so we've made this extension to the southeast, and boy, it looks like the cave is going to keep going and going and going. There's no telling how far the cave might go.